The Sydney Swans have been one of the most consistent football clubs in the past 20 years, only missing the finals on 3 separate occasions. However, if we cast our minds back in the Sydney Swans history books, this now very successful football team was once one of the worst teams in footy history and were on the brink of extinction. The Swans also hold the record for the longest premiership drought in AFL history, and this is the story of the Sydney Swans' 72-year premiership drought. So if we're going to be talking about a premiership drought which lasted over 7 decades, we have to go back to when this drought started, way back in 1933. So the year is 1933, the club at the time is located in South Melbourne and play their games at Lakeside Oval at Albert Park. Now South Melbourne was one of the inaugural teams in the VFL which was formed in 1897. Now before 1933, South Melbourne had some early success, winning 2 premierships in 1909 and 1918. But let's talk about the 1933 Grand Final. So this Grand Final was fought between South Melbourne and Richmond. Now South Melbourne basically led from start to finish throughout the afternoon, and despite the Swans' poor goal kicking, they ran out winners by 42 points, with the scores ending 9-17-71 to Richmond 4-5-29. Now a funny story to come out of this match was the fact that South Melbourne's premiership side was often referred to as the Foreigner Legion due to the high number of players in the side being recruited from interstate. The majority of their recruits at the time came from Western Australia, which earned South Melbourne the nickname of the Swans, which was actually adopted fully in 1934. Now just before we move into the relocation, let's quickly go over a few things about what happened to South Melbourne since the 1933 Premiership. So the Swans made the grand finals in the next 3 years, in 1934, 1935 and 1936, but were beaten in all 3 of those grand finals. South Melbourne then made the grand final in 1945 against Carlton, but again were beaten. And this was the last time the Swans would make the grand final as South Melbourne. In fact, the Swans only made the finals on 2 separate occasions between the years of 1945 and 1981, which were in the 1970 and 1977 seasons. But when it came to the late 1970s, South Melbourne Football Club were in major debt. And with the increasing popularity of Aussie rules football in New South Wales, and the want for the VFL to become a national league, the Victorian Football League was ready to have their first Sydney team enter the national competition. Now, a little breakdown of the situation. South Melbourne were operating at $150,000 lost in the previous 5 years. The board came to realise that the long-term viability and financial stability in Melbourne was going to be incredibly difficult, and knew that there was an untapped market in Sydney with a want for a football club. So in 1982, the South Melbourne board decided that all their home games would be played in Sydney. Now the club was still technically a Melbourne operated club in the early years of the relocation, but still playing its home games in Sydney. Now despite the big push for a Sydney-based Aussie rules team, the early years of the club's relocation wasn't met well by the people of New South Wales, with the team's average crowd numbers in 1983 being only 12,000 and the number of members only being 100. Yes, only 100 members. So the Swans didn't have the brightest of starts with the relocation, and in the next few years it looked like the decision for the relocation was a massive mistake. Now despite a few years of some success in the 80s, with some finals appearances, it didn't get much better for the Swans, with 3 consecutive wooden spoons going into the early 90s in 1992, 93 and 94, and it even got to the point where the club needed the AFL to step in and save the club with monetary and managerial supports with help from the other 15 AFL clubs at the time. And the AFL knew the only way to keep this club afloat was to take over. So the AFL decided to step in and help these struggling Swans, appointing Ron Barassi as the coach and recruiting some big money players like Dermott Brereton. But that move didn't work out the greatest, as Dermott Brereton spent more time suspended than on the field in the few years that he played at Sydney. But in a few years' time, things were about to change. In 1995, the Swans recruited a player that would change everything, being Tony Lockett. Now, Tony Lockett was the best forward of all time and still holds the record for the most goals kicked by an AFL player. Now, this was a massive player for the Swans to get, and this got people to the games, something which Sydney has been struggling to do since it relocated. And despite Ron Barassi leaving the club as the coach in 1995, this club was on the rise, and in 1996 they would claim the minor premiership with 16 wins. The Swans went on to make the grand final in that year for the first time since 1945, but unfortunately they went down to North Melbourne. But the Swans were not done yet. They were able to make the finals in 4 of the next 5 seasons, and despite a little bit of a hiccup missing finals in 1999 and 2000, the Swans were on the build for something big. This started in 2002, with the coach Rodney E being sacked midway through the season and replaced by Paul Roos. He was the caretaker coach for the rest of that season and performed so well that he got the full-time gig in 2003 going forward. The Swans then recruited Barry Hall, which had a lot of similarities to the Tony Lockett recruitment, and he thrived in his new home in Sydney, becoming a cult hero and a favourite player of yours truly. But the Swans were building a team of players that didn't perform at their previous clubs, but got a new lease on life in Sydney, such as Craig Bolton, Nick Davis, Paul Williams, and many more. This policy of picking up recycled players definitely paid off in the Paul Roos era, as they implemented this strict culture of discipline at the club, and the Swans culture is still talked about to this very day. But you guys have heard this history and this babbling for long enough. So let's get to the year where the Sydney Swans finally broke the drought. So the year is 2005, and after a good few years of making finals, the Swans were hungry for success. The Swans finished 3rd in the minor season and went up against West Coast in the qualifying final. And this is where the massive rivalry between West Coast and Sydney began, and this rivalry would last for years. Now this was a close game from start to finish, but it was the West Coast Eagles who won and sent them through to the preliminary final against Adelaide. But the Swans had to go through the hard way. They came up against the Cats in their do-or-die clash. The Swans didn't play very well at all in the first half, and they were down by 20 points at half-time. And at the three-quarter time break, the Swans were down by 19 points and couldn't kick straight. As you can see on the scorecard here, they kicked 3 goals 12 to that point in the game. So going into the last quarter, the Swans' hopes looked shot. It looked like another year of failure. But then a player by the name of Nick Davis decided to put his team on his shoulders and lead his team to victory. In the final quarter, he kicked the only 4 goals for the Swans, including this famous winner. This was enough to take the Swans to the preliminary final against the Saints, which they were able to win thanks to a 7-goal blitz in 11 minutes in the 4th quarter to overturn an 8-point deficit and overrun the Saints to a 31-point victory. This set up for an enthralling grand final contest between West Coast and the Sydney Swans. Now let's just look back at this run for a second though. So many things could have gone differently for the Swans here. In that semi-final or prelim, the Swans somehow came back against the Cats, which baffles many to this day, and if it wasn't for the 11-minute blitz from the Swans kicking 7 goals, who knows what would have happened in either of these games. But the Swans did it. For the first time since 1996, the Swans were back in the grand final. But this was not going to be easy by any stretch. The Eagles had a star-studded lineup, with Chris Judd and the 2005 Brownlow medalist in Ben Cousins leading the Eagles. The Swans weren't going to break the drought without a fight. The first quarter was widely dominated by the Eagles, but the accurate goal kicking of the Swans saw them take the lead at quarter time. In the second quarter, the Swans started to take control and kept the Eagles goalless in the second term, and the Swans took a 20-point lead into the main break. But then the comeback began in the third quarter by the Eagles. They kicked 4 goals and were able to keep the Swans goalless to set up a classic finish in the final term. The Eagles started strong in the final quarter with an early goal to Ben Cousins, followed up by some brilliant work and the finish from Hunter. And it looked like yet again another dark day for the Sydney Swans. But they weren't done just yet. A few moments later, Barry Hall got on the lead and took a great mark. Took all the pressure on his shoulders, 72 years worth of pressure, and nailed the goal. The Eagles then had a chance down the other end to restore their 10-point lead, but Banfield's shot slammed into the post. The Swans were still alive. But then only a few moments later, it ended up down in the Swans' end 20 metres out from their goal. Jason Bull tapped it down to a roving Buchanan, who ducked past Wirrapunda and jammed the goal home for the Swans. Almost reminiscent of the goal we saw just a few weeks ago. They were back in front, but only by 1 point, and there was still so much time left on the clock. The Swans had chances to widen their lead, but late in the fourth quarter, the Swans only held a 5-point lead, and the Eagles were surging. The Eagles went long inside the forward 50, players collided but the ball got out the back, but the ball just snuck through off of Nikoski's leg, and the Irishman and Tyrconnelli was able to transfer the ball over the line for a rush behind. The Swans could take a breath for only one moment though, as the kick outside the defensive 50 was intercepted by Dean Cox. One last chance for the Eagles, one last hope, and then the moment that all Swans fans have cemented in their memory.
Cox throws it onto the left. One last roll of the dice for the Eagles! Leo Barry, you star! Bob Murray, reincarnate. The longest premiership drought in football history is over! For the first time in 72 years, the Swans are champions of the AFL.
They did it, the Swans. After 72 years, they broke the drought. From the old South Melbourne supporters who had to wait so long for this moment, to the new young Swans fans who just saw their team claim their 4th premiership. This was truly a moment to savour for young and old. And as a young Sydney Swans fan, I still remember the moment as a little 5-year-old kid, sitting on the couch in my Swans gear, seeing Leo Barry leap across that pack to take that mark and then the siren blowing. I didn't realise the significance of how long 72 years was, but even I was crying with joy. So you can imagine how those South Melbourne supporters felt when those mighty Swans lifted that Premiership Cup. And who knows, this being the Sydney Swans' 150th year, maybe the Swans will have a new Premiership Cup to savour as we draw to a close in 2024. But while the Sydney Swans will have their name carved into the Premiership Cup in 2005, I think Paul Roos's final words on that day will be etched into the Sydney Swans and South Melbourne folklore for eternity.
72 years to see South Melbourne / Sydney Swans win the premiership. Here it is!
Hey guys, thanks for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. And I really hope you enjoy these little mini documentaries that we have been making over the past few months and about this particular topic being the longest premiership drought in football history. Now yes, I am a Swans fan, so this does hold a very special place in my heart, but I'm sure other football fans can recognise the significance of breaking a 72-year premiership drought. But guys, if you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave it a like and share it to a friend. It really does help grow the channel. And also make sure to subscribe, as we are planning to put out one of these types of videos every 3 weeks. So stay tuned for that, guys, and yeah, we'll catch you all in the next one.